Hello, everyone. Do you hear me very well? Very good. Thank you so much. I have so many people to thank. Of course, I thank Dilana for initiating this venture um, and for working on it and the paperwork, of course, and everything. But most importantly, I thank the Hooker Initiative and the Gandhi Society, I believe, and then all the departments that are listed here. That's very generous, and I'm so honored to be spending a few days here at McMaster, and hopefully this will be the beginning, perhaps, for other visits. So what I propose to do today, I mean, of course, the talk is about melancholy of the oppressed, but there is also, you might argue, a melancholy of the oppressors. The oppressors are also melancholy. The first part of the talk is going to be, I'm going to be talking about the melancholy of oppressors, the ways in which they are also attached, oppressors in general, colonizers, they're also attached to their fantasies of omnipotence. They're attached to their credibility. They're attached to deterrence capabilities, and they would do anything, everything in order to maintain that. So there is some kind of melancholy that is associated with oppressors. But the more productive and humanistic, and I would say just melancholy, is that of the oppressed. Why? Because they want to recover their lost dignity, their lost homeland, and everything that I have lost through colonization and through dispossession. So then the melancholy of the oppressed is actually more associated with any project that is human, humanistic, and with which we should be in solidarity in general. I have a written remarks that will stretch for perhaps, 35, 40 minutes, so I will read them, and I have some slides as well. My talk today comes out of those two books that I published, 2011, and the Melancholy Acts is actually something I published last year. So the talk is really kind of, it's a synthesis maybe of what I have arrived at so far. Okay, so let me start. And if you want me to stop, just raise your hands and I will stop, or take a break, okay? So in Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad's Marlowe argues that brute force, that is the means whereby the conquest of the earth was accomplished, and I quote, is nothing to boast of when you have it, since your strength is just an accident arising from the weakness of others. End of quote. While the contingency of brute force or strength does not make it less predatory, the weakness of others in Conrad's colonial world remains a liability, a compromised subject position that is conducive to colonizability. Colonized people do not choose to be weak, though, but they are taken advantage of precisely because of their accidental weakness. The weakness of others means here either their inability to deter or repel conquerors from taking advantage of them, or their inability to defend themselves once they have been assaulted. As Mahatma Gandhi would realize when he was in South Africa, after he was forcibly thrown out of a first-class carriage, weakness is simply not a recipe for survival. What is even worse than the accidental weakness of others is their melancholization, their production as weak, exploitable, and colonizable. For instance, Octave Manoni, a French psychoanalyst and a staunch Lacanian, once claimed about the Malagasy from Madagascar, and I quote, "Not all peoples can be colonized. Only those who experience this need." End of quote. Colonization is a need. Along the same lines, the Algerian sociologist Malek Bennani maintains, on n'est colonisé que si l'on est colonisable. On cesse d'être colonisé lorsqu'on cesse d'être colonisable. We are colonized only because we are colonizable. We cease to be colonized when we cease to be colonizable. Fair enough. Writing after the 1967 Israeli invasion and occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, Ghassan Kanafani, Palestinian writer, takes umbrage at such a colonialist mindset, which does not offer much of an improvement on the state of nature, where the survival of the fittest runs supreme. Kanafani argues in his novel, Returning to Haifa, that the exploitation of the weakness of others is the greatest crime any human being can commit. The plot of Returning to Haifa, or Aad ila Haifa, revolves around the post-1967 encounter between a bereaved Palestinian father named Said, not to be confused with Edward Said, and his biological son named Dov, whom he accidentally left behind during the 1948 Nakba, or catastrophe, and the forced expulsions of Palestinians from their land. Raised up by two Holocaust survivors and new settlers in historical Palestine, Said's biological son grows into a staunch Zionist and is presented to us as an established IOF soldier at the time of the encounter in the wake of the catastrophic 1967 defeat of the Arab armies by Israel. Even though Dov plays hardball with his unacknowledged father, Kanafani makes use of his voice strategically to couch a blistering critique of Arabs who have done little to nothing to regain control of historical Palestine in the 2 decades between the 1948 Nakba, or catastrophe, and the 1967 Naksa, or setback. I mean, I think I should emphasize these two historical moments. The Nakba is usually seen as the catastrophe of 1948, but it's also seen as the year of independence of Israel. And, and so that's, for Palestinians, that's the moment of dispossession, and the history of Palestine has to be understood from the Nakba to the present moment. So it's an ongoing Nakba, or an ongoing catastrophe, sorry. And then the 1967 war was called a setback because what Israel did was defeat the armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, take over the West Bank and Gaza, and the Sinai Desert and the Golan Heights, which it still occupies. Although after the Camp David Accords of 1978, the Sinai Desert was returned to Egypt, but it's still occupying Gaza and the West Bank. So that's the 1967 is a turning point, in other words, because it has decimated the worldview of a united Arab nation, if you want to make that argument. So anyway, to go back to Kanafani's returning to Haifa, and that return happened after 1967, because since Israel took over the West Bank, then it became possible for Palestinians to go between the West Bank and the inside of Israel. And that's why this father could basically go back to Haifa, which is inside Israel, and see his house and check if he can find his son, whom he left behind. So, fully aware of his Zionist son's victor position, Said addresses him thusly toward the end of their fraught encounter. And that's the quote for you. "The greatest crime any human being can commit, whoever he may be, is to believe, even for one moment, that the weakness and mistakes of others give him the right to exist at their expense and justify his own mistakes and crimes." The lesson that Kanafani delivers here is the exemplar of what I call in the recent book, Melancholy Acts, the melancholy of the oppressed, namely their ability to transform defeat into a space of intellection, engagement, and solidarity. The echoes with Mahatma Gandhi, who transformed himself from a shy and withdrawn young lawyer into an inspirational leader, cannot, of course, be overstressed here. Said's poignant humanist and humane lesson aims to unsettle the self-righteous complacency of his son Dov and debunk the expansionist mantra of Zionism, whose final goal is to impose, through brute force, its right to exist at the expense of the indigenous populations. I will come back to Kanafani in the second part of this talk, but let me focus the first part of the talk, as I promised, on what I call the melancholy of oppressors, through a reading of a very well-known novel by a very well-known author. In his preface to the 1956 American University edition of The Stranger, Albert Camus had this to say: I summarized The Stranger a long time ago with a remark that I admit was highly paradoxical. It's the second paragraph, okay? The English. The first one is the French. In our society, any man who does not weep at his mother's funeral runs the risk of being sentenced to death. I only meant that the hero of my book, Meursault, is condemned because he does not play the game, end of quote. So had Meursault wept at his mother's funeral, he would have participated in the game of society, namely its prescribed ritual of mourning. As Émile Durkheim points out, mourning is not the natural response of a private sensibility hurt by cruel loss. It is an obligation imposed by the group. One laments not simply because one is sad, but because one is obliged to lament. Okay. Camus understood Durkheim's observation very well. Meursault's non-compliance with his mourning obligations would later result in his prosecution and condemnation to death. At best, though, Meursault's transgression constitutes a missed opportunity. His unilateral disengagement from societal regulations could have become the inaugural moment of a wider rebellion that would eventually take on the colonial system itself. Such a course of action could have resulted, as Albert Memmi would argue, in Meursault's unequivocal denunciation of the settler colonial ambitions of French society in Algeria. Better still, he could have even joined arms with the Mujahideen in their struggle for Algerian independence. Or is it that Meursault's rebellion against funerary norms amounts to nothing more than the tormented dance of the existentialist hero who refuses societal oppression because he is at its receiving end, but turns a blind eye on colonial oppression because he is its beneficiary? So that's a rhetorical question. Meursault's rebellion against society is not at loggerheads with his consent to the colonial status quo. Considering that Meursault ends up shooting an Algerian native Arab on the beach in cold blood, one may wonder whether this act is not, after all, a displacement of or a compensation for his failure to perform his funerary obligations. In place of participating in the sociocultural expression of mourning, Meursault acts out his grief through homicidal aggression. Indeed, seconds before he shoots the Arab, the thought of his mother was not far behind, and I quote, "The sun was the same as it had been the day I buried Maman. And like then, my forehead especially was hurting me, all the veins in it throbbing under the skin." End of quote. It is rather puzzling that Meursault should still be thinking about his mother long after the funeral, despite his initial impatience with the ritual commemoration altogether. And I quote from The Stranger, "For now, it's almost as if Maman weren't dead. After the funeral, though, the case will be closed, and everything will have a more official feel to it." To say Meursault underestimated the psychic latencies of unresolved mourning is an understatement. Meursault's public repudiation of an affect, here grief, for which a need presented itself, the passing of his mother, does not necessarily mean that he successfully achieved detachment from it, much less a complete mastery of it. Meursault's murder of the native Arab may in fact be an instance of a foreclosed grief gone awry, and is disposed of in an excess of violence. And I quote from The Stranger, the excess of violence. "I fired 4 more times at the motionless body where the bullets lodged without leaving a trace," end of quote. When left unchecked or unfulfilled, an affect may swerve into a call to arms, be it colonial, decolonial, or self-inflicted violence. Meursault's gratuitous crime seems to have fulfilled the displaced psychic demand for grief from within the conventional practices of French settler colonial violence. Indeed, his decision to go back to the cool spring behind the rock only to find that it is occupied by the Arab lying on his back reenacts what we see nowadays in full display in historical Palestine, that is, the entrenched settler colonial desire to conquer, dispossess, and dispose of the native inhabitants and take their place. The murder of the Arab is first and foremost a colonial act par excellence. Not only does it partake of the racist mindset of the French settlers, but it further banalizes and perpetuates the colonial game of inflicting gratuitous deaths on natives. Ironically then, Meursault may have declined to play the funerary game of society, but he accepts and participates in the colonial game of which that same society is the product. It bears recalling here what George Orwell had to say about the nature of French colonialism in North Africa. In 1939, 3 years before Camus published The Stranger, Orwell published a short story titled Marrakesh, a city in mid-southwestern Morocco. And he says, people with brown skins are next door to invisible in Marrakesh, describing the funeral procession in which a corpse on a wooden bier is chased by a cloud of flies while being carried on the shoulders of 4 mourners. Orwell points out that the invisibility, dehumanization, and disposability of the natives are the underlying principles of European imperialism. And that's the big quote there. When you see how the people live, and still more how easily they die, it is always difficult to believe that you are walking among human beings. All colonial empires are in reality founded upon that fact. The people have brown faces. Besides, there are so many of them. Are they really the same flesh as yourself? Do they even have names? Or are they merely a kind of undifferentiated brown stuff, about as individual as bees or coral insects? End of quote. To speak of the legacy of French colonialism in North Africa is precisely to speak of a legacy of ungrieved lives, a legacy of countless horrors and atrocities for which grief is overdue. No wonder then the narrator of Kamal Dawood's The Meursault Investigation rages against the colonial and post-colonial systems of amnesia, which resulted in the total erasure of the story of Meursault's Arab victim. Even in the novel, The Stranger, with which I hope you are aware, or which you have read, the victim of Meursault is just called the Arab. It doesn't have a name. Dawood's novel presents itself at the outset as a counter-narrative to Camus. And this is readily visible in the original French title. Meursault, in the French title, is called Meursault contre-enquête, which means Meursault, a counter-investigation. As Dawood puts it in the words of his protagonist, the novel is written in the same language of Camus. It's written in French, but from right to left. So using the logic of Arabic, okay, from right to left, while French is from left to right. So it's an interesting kind of combination and justification at the same time. The challenge for Dawood's protagonist then is to write in French from left to right and to tell the other side of the story, the Arab side, following the logic of Arabic from right to left. The narrator of Dawood's novel named Harun claims that he is being pursued by the ghost of his brother, whose name we discover is Musa, whom Meursault killed. But it is not until the end of the novel that we learn that Harun had indeed killed a Frenchman, a French colon named Joseph, who had no clear connection, much less any involvement in the murder of Musa, his brother. And he says, I killed Joseph because I had to counterbalance the absurdity of our situation, which underlies this almost like a tribal mentality. Dawood's novel may be a reversal of Camus, but in terms of its central action, it is a repetition of the crime, which reduces the anti-colonial movement of the Algerian resistance into the same existentialist crisis in which Camus was interested. Its ruminations on the way out of the colonial apparatus resonates with Kattab Yassin's rhetorical question in his novel Najma, and I quote, "Can crime alone assassinate injustice?" End of quote. But while Harun's crime is a repetition of Meursault's, it is nonetheless a repetition without equivalence. Arguably, the violence of the oppressed may not be that different from the violence of the oppressor, but it is hardly identical to it. Fanon's historicization of the origins of violence in the colonial encounter between colonizers and natives need little corroboration here. Suffice it to mention, in the words of Herbert Marcuse, that colonized populations, and I quote, do not start a new chain of violence, but they do try to break out of an established one, end of quote. Surely they have an undeniable right to self-defense and self-determination. The colonized man liberates himself in and through violence, as Fanon goes on to say. But what Fanon unequivocally condemns is brutalism or disproportionate revolutionary violence. Because we want a democratic and renovated Algeria, because we believe one cannot rise and liberate oneself in one area and sink in another, we condemn with pain in our hearts those brothers who have flung themselves into revolutionary action with almost physiological brutality that centuries of oppression give rise to and feed, end of quote. I'm halfway through my talk, and I'm going to switch to Melancholy of the Oppressed, okay? And here I'm going to speak about Ghassan Kanafani, who lived a very short life. Actually, he was assassinated by the Mossad in Lebanon with his niece when he was only 36. This happened in 1972. 36 is the same age, when Fanon himself died. So imagine if those two geniuses lived longer, we would have been richer, maybe, at least intellectually and creatively. But it's very sad that they died at such a young age. So throughout his short-lived career, Kanafani never tired of foregrounding the lived experiences of defeated and marginalized individuals, not to profess or worship the structural vulnerability or fragility of human beings as such, but to draw attention to their man-made plights and struggles and to use them as the basis for a bottom-up and horizontal vision of solidarity with besieged humanity. Kanafani's literary moralia is dispersed throughout his oeuvre, but I will restrict my final comments here to a very interesting and I would say very relevant, pertinent, timely epistle called Waraqa min Gaza, or Letter from Gaza. It's a letter from Gaza, which is an early epistle that Kanafani wrote when he was only 20 years old. For those unfamiliar with this moving piece of literature, I recommend you listen to John Berger's recitation of this short story. I think it's 15 minutes on YouTube. A very moving recitation, actually, and at the end of the video, John Berger almost breaks into tears, okay? So anyway, the nameless speaker, who is the stand-in for Kanafani, the author, addresses his letter to his childhood friend Mustafa, whom he is supposed to join in Sacramento, California. Mustafa seems to have made all the necessary arrangements for his friend's move to Sacramento to study civil engineering in the University of California. So both of these childhood friends had long ago vowed to carry on living together, to get out of Gaza, and to become rich. Mustafa jumped on the first opportunity and left for California, while the speaker and the writer of the letter moved to Kuwait to make enough money to pay for his trip. The speaker wrote the letter to Mustafa between 1955 and 1956, at a time when Israel increased its crackdown on returnees to their homes. This was called the David Ben-Gurion's War on Infiltration. Israel launched several large-scale attacks on Gaza in the lead-up to the late October 1956 tripartite aggression on Egypt by Israel, France, and Britain. It was in between these brutal Israeli onslaughts on Gaza that the speaker and the writer of the letter returns home from Kuwait to prepare himself for his imminent trip to California. Gaza's familiar scenes of wreckage, misery, and desolation, not to mention the foul odor of defeat which had filled his nostrils since the Nakba, only intensified the speaker's self-dejection and urge to flee to green California and to sever all ties with his depressive and depressing home here, Gaza. Turning the page swiftly on the wretched homeland and running away from all the obstacles to his self-flourishing in a remote land of limitless opportunity is the only form of salvation that had eaten up the speaker's mind until he makes a visit to his beautiful 13-year-old niece, Nadia, in the Gaza hospital and sees her completely amputated leg. Much to his own embarrassment, he discovered that, and I quote from the story, okay, where is it? Oh, it's not there. The quote is not there. I missed it. This is the quote from the story. Nadia had lost her leg when she threw herself on top of her little brothers and sisters to protect them from the bombs and flames that had fastened their claws into the house. Nadia could have saved herself. She could have run away, rescued her leg, but she didn't. End of quote. Nadia's tale of selfless sacrifice unsettled the speaker. His egocentric escapist schemes have, compared to Nadia's altruistic heroism, turned into sore points, fomenting in him feelings of ire and self-contempt. Kanafani makes use of the epistolary convention not only to solicit the confidentiality and trust of the reader, but also to create an overlapping communicative space from which to mentor and mobilize his immediate addressee, Mustafa, and his readers at large. Not only does the pedagogical encounter with Nadia compel the speaker to reckon with the incumbent task of solidarity with his own defeated yet unvanquished people, it also propels him to seek to transform the alienating social norms of intelligibility that feed rather than fight the desire for flight. It is in this sense that we must understand his final exhortation to Mustafa, and I quote, oh, this one is there. I won't come to you, but you return to us. Come back to learn from Nadia's leg amputated from the top of the thigh what life is and what existence is worth. Come back, my friend. We are all waiting for you. End of quote. Settler colonial power is never more successful than when it drives a wedge between Palestinians and their homeland. The speaker's belated melancholic turn is not a turn away from Gaza, but a return to that uncanny and repressed yet originary and incipient feeling that bound him and Mustafa to Gaza, which he now sees in a new light following his encounter with Nadia. And this is yeah, this is how he sees Gaza, although nothing changed. It's just his perception that changed. Everything is in this new Gaza rose up in sadness. ينتفض حزنا over Nadia's amputated leg from the top of the thigh. It was not the kind of sadness that stopped at weeping. It was defiance. Even more than that, it was something akin to the restoration of the amputated leg. In his emotionally charged address to Mustafa, the speaker capitalizes on the spectral void created by the amputated leg as the focus and locus of melancholia. That is, the process of psychoaffective investment that generates and sustains attachment to a sense of national consciousness, sovereignty, and belonging, produced before, during, and after the Nakba, and inculcated through a dizzying seriality of losses and unifying collective woes. In this sense, melancholic attachment is not confined to the search for the concrete meaning of Nadia's loss, but extends contiguously to the void created by the disappearance, erasure, and ethnic cleansing of historical Palestine, and to the incumbent task of rescuing loss from loss into perpetuity. In fact, before closing his letter by calling on Mustafa to come back home, the speaker signals to him the urgent necessity to recoup and retool the enigmatic feeling he experienced when he was leaving Gaza the first time. And I quote, "This obscure feeling that you had as you left Gaza, this small feeling must grow into a giant deep within you. It must expand. You must seek it in order to find yourself here among the ugly debris of defeat." End of quote. Kanafani institutes the process of melancholic mobilization, or what I call in the book, Melancholy Acts, the process of melancholicization. Melancholicization, okay? As the horizon of decolonial subjectivity. He wagers on the recuperation, cultivation, and emancipication of an enigmatic, originally affective tie as the conduit for the tangled processes of self-individuation, solidarity, and resistance. When confronted with the weakness of others, Kanafani insists in Letter from Gaza and elsewhere that tarrying with individual salvation, as the speaker and Mustafa did, is not an ethically responsible response. So Kanafani's Letter from Gaza exemplifies how the melancholy of the oppressed operates even from within extreme conditions of precarity, defeat, and weakness, and the way it sets alight in the speaker an infectious allegorical longing for collectivity and solidarity that is, in the final analysis, indissociable from the overlapping processes of individuation and national liberation. Insofar as it compelled the speaker to recognize the fierce urgency of political solidarity with the amputee Nadia and with her besieged and bombarded Gaza, Kanafani's story is the product of an exemplum of the melancholy of the oppressed, in which melancholization emerges as a symptom of colonization, where melancholicization as the midwife of decolonization. Indeed, the lesson of Kanafani's epistle is not just to pay tribute to Nadia's memory, but also to ensure that her original commitment to collective salvation continues to inspire the struggle for national liberation and for an end to the ethno-settler apartheid occupation of historical Palestine. In a geopolitical battlefield that had for decades been the geostrategic target of Orientalist locutions, melancholicizing is a delicate pedagogical process of enhancing critical consciousness and as much as sensitization and learning of ideologically imbued modes of intelligibility. So I'm transitioning to my concluding remarks here. Kanafani's Letter from Gaza, in which the epistolary form of the story makes possible an arresting chiastic reversal from melancholization to melancholicization, dramatizes the process of ethical and empathic indignation in tandem with the speaker's cognitive reversal and revised remapping of Gaza in light of Nadia's story of selfless sacrifice. The speaker's counterintuitive decision to let go of the opportunity to pursue a potentially happy life in California matches only his eagerness to hold on to a life of utter suffering and misery in wounded and bleeding Gaza. The speaker agrees to assume a position of compassion, exposure, and vulnerability, and to take the same risks that Nadia took when she intervened on behalf of her brothers, in an attempt to finally live a life worthy of its name, a life of selfless sacrifice, irreducible to the pursuit of happiness he would have experienced it had he joined Mustafa in California. So this belated fantasy of vulnerability as a condition of collectivity, of being with and for others, may very well serve as a corrective to the speaker's earlier abnegation of responsibility, and as a signal of an ethics of solidarity that does not stop at bearing witness to the pain and suffering of the victims of Zionist oppression, but further commits to being there among them in the midst of peril and precarity. There is a widely accepted liberal humanist view that mourning is progressive and melancholy is regressive. Freud may have suggested as much before he reversed course. Walter Benjamin had at the outset understood the creative powers of melancholy, despite his well-known invective against left-wing melancholy. Fanon is perhaps the first psychoanalyst and psychiatrist, I might add, who appropriated the modern European concept of melancholy to the colonial context. In Fanonian anti-colonial psychoanalysis, the concept of melancholy acquires a militant and combative edge, not unlike the one it has later acquired in the context of queer activism. If Edward Said is right in arguing that when concepts travel, they become radical, then there is perhaps no better example of a traveling concept than Fanon's acculturated melancholy. The weaponization of melancholy by Fanon may sound a bit exaggerated, yet it is understandable from within the context of decolonization in which every insurrectionary asset, including affective archives, has to be mobilized in the service of the war of independence. In his work on postmodernism, the late Fred Jameson laments the waning of affects into mere intensities in late capitalist Western culture. In his other work on national allegory, he laments the attenuation of cultural politics in Euro-America. In order to point toward an alternative model in which cultural politics still matters, he had to reach out to non-European cultures. He makes eclectic forays into Asian and African cultural arenas in order to underscore the politics of literature and film, a politics that is still dominant in non-Western cultures, but that has gone almost lacking in the West. The same can be said about affect. Affect in non-Western cultures, such as the Arab world, has not waned. Yet, unlike the Orientalist standard view of Orientals as passionate and emotional or impulsive to the extreme, modern-day Arabs, for one, experience affect at the intersection of the individual, the collective, and the political. The recent 2011 Arab uprisings, for instance, started primarily as a visceral affective response to the self-immolation of a fruit vendor whose name is Muhammad Bouazizi. They went on to wreak havoc in the entire region and to destroy one dictator after another. So throughout the book I have just published last year, I call for a comparative ethics of reading the narrative temporalities of the psyche, especially in the Arab world, at the crossroads of geopolitics and poetic form. And I distinguish between paralyzing, compulsive, and reactionary melancholizing patterns of behavior, and self-reflective and productive, as well as future-oriented melancholicizing practices, which are operative in literary, cultural, and intellectual products or in grassroots socio-political movements of resistance. Attending to the particularities of these melancholicizing practices as they come to be rhetorically embedded in specific theoretical, visual, or literary text as those by Kanafani offers a key corrective to the melancholizing terms of reception of Arab culture in transnational contexts, increasingly cast under the shadow of Euro-American soft power influence. Thank you so much. I kept 40 minutes as I promised.